looks, we're missing some people. Who isn't here, as best you can tell? That's funny. I don't want to wait too long for stragglers, but I also want everybody to hear this lecture from beginning to end. Uh-oh. Oh, we were just talking about you. We were about to call security. We were about to put together a search party. The Coast Guard, yeah. So, hey, real quick, did Kathy explain to you that she made some announcements, right?
Yes. T-shirts.
T-shirts?
Group picture before
Group picture? Okay, good. So, you got all the information from her. Another late arrival. What is going on here? Oh, man.
killing us.
All right, so let's just jump into this. So this morning's talk is very important for a multitude of reasons. Hey, if I could just get your attention, please. Sorry. I hate to interrupt. I know whatever you're talking about is just critical and so important. But we've also got a lecture, we got to get started. I'm teasing. All right, so this next talk is extremely important for a multitude of reasons, not least of which is it's about the resurrection, right? It's about Jesus. So we've talked a lot about the gospel, referencing, and I don't want to steal any of your thunder, Shane, but referencing, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about, hey, this is the gospel that I received, and this is the gospel that I'm passing on to you, that, Jesus lived, died for our sins, rose from the dead, and appeared to his homeboys, and then he appeared to me, and this is important. And if the resurrection, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, and if the resurrection isn't true, if the resurrection didn't happen, yeah, what's the point? We're wasting our time. And so, a big question is kind of baked into this statement. Like, well, how do we know the resurrection is true? Paul was talking to people that could go and perhaps question the eyewitnesses. Paul was talking to people that, were in that immediate area, right? That there was this big difference between where we're standing and where they're standing. And so Shane's going to talk about how we know that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Shane's going to talk to us about the good reasons to believe that this was a real historical event, that this is baked into space and time, that this is objective, that there are good reasons to believe this outside of your feelings and your personal experiences, which are important, but the resurrection is not anchored to that. The resurrection is anchored to a real, true historical event. That's what Shane's going to discuss. Shane received his BA in Liberal Studies from Cal State in Fullerton and an MA in Historical Theology from Westminster Seminary in California. He is the executive producer of The White Horse in radio broadcast and a contributing editor for Modern Reformation magazine, and serves as the assistant pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church, OPC, in St. Charles, Missouri. And there's something else that's really cool about Shane. So he gets to interact with this radio show that I enjoy a lot. It's called The White Horse Inn. How many of you have heard of The White Horse Inn? A couple of you. Very cool. So do you remember last night when we had three guys on stage that were kind to one another, but yet they had different opinions? Remember how fun that was to listen to them banter and go back and forth, and sometimes even disagree sharply, but under the umbrella of unity on the essential issues. So Shane produces this radio show, and you've got, if I understand correctly, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, and a Reformed Baptist, or
right now it's a kind of a mixed up panel, so it's occasionally a Baptist or a non-denominational, or and then we also interview people from other traditions. We'll talk with a Catholic, or we'll talk with a wide spectrum of folks just to get the different opinions.
Excellent, even better than the podcasts that I have saved. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear these various perspectives on extremely relevant topics pertaining to theology, apologetics, cultural events, sometimes science, sometimes philosophy, sometimes history, ethics. I mean, it's very base camp-esque. Or I should say, base camp is very White Horse Inn-esque, because you guys have been around a lot longer. But anyway, I love that radio broadcast. I really encourage you to check it out. Shane also does discussions at your church, and that's every other. Tell me the calendar.
The Friday Night Forum is sort of right now a couple times a year, based on my schedule. So there's announced on our church website. So if cpcopc.org events.
And it's on the Faith Ascent calendar
Right.
usually as well. So if you guys go to the Faith Ascent website, click the button that says calendar. Very simple. And just, keep an eye out for the Friday Night Forum with Shane Rosenthal. So those are fun discussions. I'm going to let you take it from here,
All right.
Shane, but give him a warm welcome. Hey, by the way, so these are all first-year students.
First years.
Yeah, so second-year students are in a different room, but this is a lively crowd, and I am sure that they're going to have some top-shelf questions for you.
All right. Well, I decided to start off this morning with a quiz, just to get the mind rolling. And this quiz right here, the first question is on your screen here. The good thing is this is not a written sort of exam. It's a multiple choice. And therefore, all I need you to do is to look at the various options here. And the various options are, let me back this out a little bit. So the question starts with, what city was the Declaration of Independence signed? And the options are, A, you can figure out which is the best you like. My family raised me to believe it was in Lincoln, Nebraska. You like that one? No, okay. So no one really knows since it happened so long ago. That's option 2. Anybody want to vote for that one?
No.
Believing that the Declaration was signed in my own hometown makes me feel good about myself and gives me positive energy. No takers yet, huh?
No.
All right. Maybe it's D or E. For some people, it was signed in Austin, Texas. For others, it was signed in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But the important thing is where you think it was signed. Still no. Last one. I was invited to a place with really cool and friendly people who all believed it was signed in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm amazed at the sincerity and awesomeness of those people. We don't have any takers? Let's change from history then to math. All right, so math. What is 5 to the third power? All right, now don't say it out loud. If you're kind of forgetting what happened since this is summer and you flush everything out from the previous year, it's 5 times 5 times 5. All right, here are the options. All right, first option. So many students at my school give so many different answers, who's to know who's right? All right, B. It's only narrow-minded bigots who think there's only one right answer. All answers are equally valid. Anybody want to go that way? I interpret the question to mean, see, what is this question, 5 times 5 times 5, is what is my favorite color? Therefore, the correct answer to this question is purple. You have a question? You want to take that one? All right. We got one taker on the purple. 5 to the third power is purple. D, my favorite number is 26, and believing in that number has changed my life. Therefore, I know in my heart that the answer is 26. Anybody want to go that way? We got one purple, and anybody want to go 26? Can I hear? Okay, we got 26 in the back. E, I read this cool book by this really awesome dude who said that numbers are bendable. I can't really explain it because the answer is totally mystical and mysterious. Bendable numbers, huh? That's pretty cool stuff right there. Yeah. Flexible, bendable. All right, so in the world of religious questions, we often hear these kinds of statements. Now, what I've been doing there is sort of going through issues of history and math, and those kinds of answers in history and math seem a little bit absurd. Would you agree?
Yeah.
All right. Well, the fact is, that's standard fare in the world of religion for some reason. All right. Now, we hear statements such as, I believe the Book of Mormon because I feel it in my heart. Or Joel Osteen makes me feel good about myself. therefore I know it's true. Or, I'm an atheist because religion is a joke. Or, Hinduism has changed my life. It works for me, so I know it's true. I was raised to believe that Muhammad is God's prophet. So I was raised that way. I feel it. I experience it. Again, think about what we just talked about it with history or math. How about this one? No one can ever really know what happened to Jesus since it happened so long ago. Believing in one particular religion is so narrow-minded. One particular religious truth claim, it's narrow-minded. All religious truths, all paths lead to the same place. And then last, some people believe in Buddha, others believe in Jesus. The important thing is what you believe. You see what I'm doing here? Okay, so when we compare just the normal way that we know normal facts to religious claims, when you take these religious kinds of statements and apply them to other areas of your life, they sound kind of silly. And this is the point. Religious and worldview questions focus on beliefs about ultimate things. They are no less factual-based than issues of math or history. There is either one God or there are many gods. There's either one God, no God, many gods, there's a spiritual force. One of these is going to be true. Right? They can't all be true. This is dealing with ultimate things, and there are just a limited options. You can have a lot more options than these four, but these kind of give you the categories, right? Some people will have a different name for the one God, different monotheistic faiths, and there are different versions of polytheism, and there are different spectrum. There's a different list of kinds of beliefs on the spectrum of atheism. There's atheism and agnosticism and skepticism, and there are different kinds of ideas of the Force. There's the traditional Buddhism, and then there's the Star Wars variety. So essentially, but these kind of crystallize. If there is a force, an impersonal force, then there can't be a God. And if there is a God, atheism can't be true. All right? Well, here's another thing. What happens when you die? There are just a few options here for us, right? There is either a heaven and hell, or there's reincarnation, or we become one with the universe, or we cease to exist. If atheism is true, we cease to exist. Well, that's not compatible with we do have an afterlife, and we continue on in some kind of heaven and hell. So in other words, one of those things is going to happen to you when you die. It's pretty concrete. They can't all be true. So I like number 3 there. Have you ever heard about the Buddhist who went to the hot dog vendor and he said, "Hey, can you make me one with everything?" All right, so here's the thing, though. Given all the options in the world, if you talk about all the different various religious options in those various categories, there are thousands of conflicting views and beliefs about the nature of reality. What makes you think your view is right? If you think about it, just in terms of 1 out of 4, you believe in one God, or the other 1 out of 4, you believe in heaven and hell. There is an afterlife. That's 1 out of 4. So in terms of chance, you're likely to be wrong, right? Just in terms of the odds, the mathematical odds are saying 75% chance that you're wrong. All the other views are there. And your view is in the minority of the options. And yet that is the way it works when it comes to other facts. For example, 5 times 5 times 5. Anybody know what the real number is? What's 125? Now, of all the possible options, the truth is in the distinct minority. Right? But we get there to the answer by actually using our minds and our reason to calculate that answer. But the truth is always in the minority. All right? So the question is, what's your criteria for being the odd man out, for having a position about truth. Something we need is, we need something more than chance. We need to go with something beyond the odds. Yes, you're going to be in the minority in terms of the facts if you argue for a particular answer to be the true way. But so is everybody else. So there's that. But we also need something more than warm, fuzzy feelings. Warm, fuzzy feelings don't get us to the truth. You may have warm, fuzzy feelings as a fruit of your faith, right? You may love the idea that Benjamin Franklin was a kite maker. It may give you wonderful feelings, right? But it's true whether or not you have the warm, fuzzy feelings, right? You need something more than family tradition. Every religious kid from every religious tradition has a family tradition that they're raised with. So just to say I was raised this way doesn't make it right. Lots of people were raised with lots of different conflicting views. We need something more than spiritual intuition. Again, not that family tradition is bad, or that warm, fuzzy feelings are bad, or that spiritual intuition or insight is bad. It's just that it's not the foundation of your faith. It's not the foundation of the facts. Spiritual intuition. There are a lot of people from a lot of different faiths who have spiritual intuition. They think, in terms of that they've been revealed something, and it's a key truth. We need something more than religious experience. If you look around the world, there are a lot of people who are having a lot of different religious experiences. And they justify their religion based on the fact that they had an amazing religious experience. I felt at one with the universe when I had that hot dog. I felt at one with God when I went to Mecca. That's what that is. I felt this amazing communal experience with people at my synagogue. We need something more than sincere devotion. A lot of people like to talk about devotion and sincerity. Yeah, sincerity and devotion are good. It's just not the foundation. A lot of people can be sincerely wrong. We need something more than loving communities. This is a Mormon stake, a Mormon church, and very loving communities. And if you were a part of that congregation, I'm sure you would feel connected. You would feel like there's a purpose, and you would feel at home, especially when everybody is affirming what you believe. So the question then is, if that's not the foundation, what is the foundation? We need something more than a mountaintop experience and transcendental moments. Again, nothing wrong with mountaintop experiences or this sort of moment where you feel at one, where you notice the signs of the Creator's presence by looking at the stars. But again, people can have that from various religious traditions. So, we seem to know how to do this when it comes to math and history. Can I get a couple of volunteers? If you want to volunteer. Okay, stand up. And you, stand up. All right. Now, I have a question for you. Start with you.
All right.
When you need to figure out the maximum amount of weight that a beam will support, and someone tells you, as you're working on this house, see the picture of the house? Yep. When someone tells you there's not one true answer to this question about the maximum weight, all answers are equally valid. What would you tell that person?
That's not true.
What else would you say? How do you know? I mean, what would you...
Not all answers can be valid.
Anything else you'd say?
Nope.
Nothing else?
Nope.
What if you were his boss?
He's fired.
He's fired! That's a good answer. Why would you fire him?
Because he's not using logic and reason.
And also, he might do what?
Break the house.
He might break the house. He might kill somebody. All right? All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Give him a round of applause. Thank you for firing the man. All right, next question for you is, what would you say if a friend told you, I was raised to believe the Holocaust never happened? If your friend told you that, what would you say?
Why?
Why do you believe that?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Give her a hand. After she says, because again, I was raised that way, you might furnish her a picture. Give her some historical evidence. Show her some history books. Give her eyewitness testimony of people who are still alive who were there at Auschwitz or one of the camps. It's not enough just to say I was raised that way. The way your family was raised has to be consistent with the facts. Now, this is where Christianity has a really good advantage. The Bible does not tell us, try it, you'll get warm, fuzzy experiences. Go with your family tradition. It doesn't say have mountaintop experiences. It doesn't say those things are bad, but it rests its truth claim by saying things like, this is Acts chapter 17, verse 31, God has given proof to all by raising Jesus from the dead. He has given proof to all by raising Jesus from the dead. And also, 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ is not risen, your faith is useless. This is a really, really strange thing in the world of religious claims. Religious claims tend to be more like the ones we've been looking at. This is something that I've experienced in my heart. It's changed me. Again, that may be true, and it may be something to talk to your friends about, but it's in terms of looking at various religious options, it's not the ground that you find in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the number one claim, in the book of Acts in particular, as they are going around the world explaining what happened and preaching from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to Rome and the ends of the earth, when they're proclaiming what has happened, they're proclaiming the resurrection as an actual fact and as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. And it's that intersection between the witnesses of the Old Testament, seeing ahead of time, and writing ahead of time, and then the witnesses of the first century, describing the thing that they saw with their own eyes. It's the intersection of those two things where you really find early Christian proclamation. Again, it's something that's being claimed that happened in history that's true. In other words, if Jesus actually rose again from the dead, everyone should be a Christian, regardless of how they were raised or what they feel inside. If it really happened, we should believe it in the same way that we should believe that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon or that Benjamin Franklin lived and started a printing press, or that the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia. It shouldn't be a matter of saying, I believe it because I was raised that it was signed in Lincoln, Nebraska. That's not going to get you anywhere. You say, I believe it because it's true and it really happened. And if it's true and it really happened, everybody should believe it. Well, then the question is, now you have a conversation that's rooted in the facts. So then how can we know whether Jesus really rose again from the dead? Let's talk about the facts themselves and what's the basis for our belief about these particular facts. Many Christians in our day simply assume the trustworthiness of Scripture without first asking the question of why they're worthy of our trust. And this is okay in a Christian community where you have an agreed consensus about the trust of these documents. So you can work in a Christian community with a mutual trust that these are inspired. But when you yourself are wondering, why am I different from my other neighbors? Or when you want to communicate to a friend who doesn't have that trust, you may ask the question, well, why are these trustworthy? In an increasingly pluralistic and secular age, you will definitely meet and interact with people who don't have that trust. And so you need to ask the question, why do I believe these texts to be trustworthy? And you need to be ready to give an answer to those so that you can, to be ready to give an answer for the hope that's within you. So why do you believe this particular book or any holy book? Why this holy book versus that holy book? It's a really good and important question to have. So here's what I would do. I talked just a moment ago about the intersection between Old Testament prophecy and the eyewitness testimony of the early disciples. Think about this one prophecy that's found in Isaiah 53. So I want to read a section here from Isaiah 53, and I want to show you some amazing things about this one prophecy. In fact, in the book of Isaiah, if you want a little bit of background, Isaiah was writing sometime around 700 BC, and he is writing at the time of what's called the Assyrian crisis. The Assyrians are invading Jerusalem. guy named Sennacherib is in charge, and they're invading, they had invaded all the cities of the northern kingdom and all the cities of the southern kingdom, and the only city is left is Jerusalem. And Isaiah is writing during that conflict, and he is also saying that some of the things that Isaiah predicts actually happen in the short term. But then he also predicts longer term things like Jerusalem will be taken captive by Babylon and will come back by a guy named Cyrus. Actually names it by name. This happens 150 years later. By name, he's very, very accurate. And then he predicts things that happen hundreds and hundreds of years later in the time of Jesus, such as this in Isaiah 53. So in those prophecies, in the 40s, God will say, can your idols speak a thing and declare a thing? And they cannot, for they are dumb idols. But I can speak a thing before it happens so that you may know that I am God. In other words, this is a good place to go to get the sense that this is not just spiritual ideas that help you as therapy, but this is actually a divine voice speaking in this passage. It's a divine voice. Why is it a divine voice? Because he speaks a thing before it happens. In fact, he's so clear in his prophecies about what's going to happen that many secularists, people who have the assumption that Isaiah is not a divine text, it's just another religious text, they actually say there's two Isaiahs. One was written after the time of Cyrus, because you can't actually predict that a guy named Cyrus will come. So somebody wrote a second version of Isaiah, the second part, and they put the name Cyrus in after the fact. Okay, as a hypothesis goes, it's a pretty good idea if you don't like the idea of a supernatural text. The problem is this part of the book of Isaiah. This part of the book of Isaiah talks about Christ, and we know that this particular section was not written after the fact because in 1948 we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we found 200 copies of Isaiah that are 200 years before Christ. And they were so meticulously kept. If we look at the copies we had, there were about 1000 AD. The copies that we had were so meticulously kept that when we compared them to these texts from 200 BC, it's almost 1,000 years difference, 1,200 year difference. There were just a few letter changes, spelling updates, but no significant changes. If anything, there was one particular word that dropped out in our copy, and I'll point that out here as we read this, that should be put back in. All right, so here's the text that we have a copy of from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's the text. Highlights of it anyway, from verse 5. It talks about the suffering servant, and it says, he was pierced for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. All we like sheep have gone astray, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was cut off of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. Where'd I go? And then they made his grave with the wicked and a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence. There was no deceit in his mouth, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him, and he has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, and he shall prolong his days. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see light. That word light is what is not in some of your English translations. It is there in the Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, and it's there in the Dead Sea Scroll copy. The Masoretic text, which a lot of our... So in some translations like the NIV, this word is there. If you look at the ESV, it is not there, but it is there in the Dead Sea Scroll version, which is the oldest copy we have. He shall see light and be satisfied. By his knowledge he, the righteous one, my servant, shall make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. All right, so if you look at this particular passage and you follow the logic, it says that the Messiah who is going to come, this suffering servant, he is going to come and he's going to die. He's going to be cut off from the land of the living. Did you catch that part? And then it says he's going to be laid in the grave. Again, another indication of his death. And then God somehow promises to prolong his days. Wait, you just told me he died. and he's going to be put in the grave. But now his days are going to be prolonged. And then we see that the servant sees light and then divides the spoils in a victory celebration. People who die typically don't do any dividing of spoils and celebration. It's not a thing, typically. This is an amazing passage which really is quoted 4 or 5 different times, alluded to in the New Testament various times. He wrote this around 700 something BC, and as I mentioned, the Dead Sea Scrolls have confirmed for us that this is an ancient text. The people did not make up this text to show here's a seeming prophecy that shows, that corresponds to what Jesus did. No, this was definitely written long before Jesus. All right, so then, is it possible that the Gospels are works of fiction, then, that were made to look as though this Jesus guy fulfilled these Old Testament prophecies? If the prophecies are before Jesus, perhaps the Gospels are works of fiction. Yeah, it's possible, but it's also possible that the moon's core is made of cheese. The question isn't what's possible. The question, rather, is what appropriate conclusions should we draw from the facts? Does that make sense? What conclusions should we draw from the facts? You could say, yeah, I think the moon's made of cheese. Okay, well, that's your opinion. And I was raised to believe that the moon was made of cheese. I feel in my heart the moon is made of cheese. Well, the question is, what do the facts say? When they went to the moon and they took rocks, did they find any cheese? All right. No, they did not. What inferences can you make from the facts? The inference you can make is that they look very rockish and not cheese-ish at all. All right, so there was a guy who is currently at Cambridge University who has written a number of books that have sort of challenged some of the liberal, skeptical hypotheses about the New Testament. And one of the things he says is, if you think about the New Testament in terms of eyewitness testimony, what you find is that testimony itself as a genre, as a kind of a thing, is rooted in the idea that whenever you need an eyewitness to give you information about something, it's partly rooted in the idea that you can't get that information in other ways. All right? If Mrs. Smith, no, let's make it more fun. It's Professor Plum is your only witness concerning what Colonel Mustard was doing on the night of the 14th in the billiard room. If Professor Plum's your only witness, you have no other recourse other than a few, small little details like the blood stain and the NCIS kind of thing where maybe there's a little bit of a hair on the weapon and you can do the DNA analysis. But if you don't have any of that, if you just have Professor Plum's word, he's your best guide. The question, though, is, can we trust Professor Plum? Because we can't get to the facts. If he says he saw it, that's pretty good testimony. But the question is he trustworthy? And if you establish the trustworthiness of a witness, then you trust them. And if you show that a particular witness has a penchant for lying and deceiving, then you show they're not trustworthy and you don't trust them. But you can't actually get beyond, and this is what this one guy, Richard Bauckham at Cambridge, has tried to do in a lot of his works. He's trying to show, if you look at the New Testament and you evaluate whether or not the witnesses are trustworthy, you actually find some interesting things. In other words, when you look at the general flavor of the New Testament and you evaluate, are these documents giving us reliable information about the people and the places? Do they have the feel of actual history? Or do they have the flavor of sort of fiction, fan fiction? There's a lot of Jesus fan fiction out there. Second and third and fourth century Jesus fan fiction. The Gnostic Gospels, people sort of writing stories about Jesus because he became a kind of a superhero figure in the popular concept. And now you have stories written about Jesus as a kid getting mad at his friends and turning them into goats. It's a thing, infancy gospels. But they're later, and if you look at the information embedded in those gospels, you'll find weird things, such as there's not a lot of historical or geographical information in those texts that you can even evaluate. There's sort of, it's obviously later works of fiction, and it's easy to evaluate. So one of the things this guy did is he looks at a new database of names that was put together about a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half ago, of let's look at all the names in a database of ancient Near Eastern Palestinian records. From ossuaries, that's like funeral boxes, names on the boxes, from all the documents, from records, and they put all those individual names, representative, not just like if they mention the name Peter twice, you're not going to put him in twice, you're going to put him in once. All right? Just to get an idea for the various individuals. And so far, this database has something like 3,000 names. And then when you evaluate the names in the New Testament, according to that, something amazing happens. Think about this way. If you were to write a fiction set in the mid-1800s, 1850s, you probably wouldn't use the name Schuyler or Dakota, all right? Those are modern names in our world, right? What names would you use? Somebody think of a name that you would use in the 1850s. John would be one. What else? Margaret. Horace, there you go. So now the question is, as you do that, as you are inventing these names, did you think would be, how well would you do if you evaluate those guesses according to the actual database of gravestones, et cetera, from the 15... In other words, would you get the ratios right in terms of what are the most popular names and what are those other names that wouldn't even appear on the list? How well do you think you would do? Probably not very well. Well, they've actually looked at some of these other Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, and it turns out that those other names, whenever you have, like the Gnostic Gospels, the secret Gospel of Mary Magdalene, whenever you have the Acts of Pilate, whenever you have these other names, you have some shared names with what you find in the Gospels. Matthew appears, John appears, but when they have new names, they don't appear on this list. They are, names that the guy invented that weren't actually Palestinian. But when you look at the New Testament names, what you find are this. The top names that appear in the Gospels and Acts, when you combine them all, are, according to the first list, if you can see, I'll zoom in a little bit here. The first category there are Simon, Joseph, Joses, John, Judah, Jacob, Eleazar, Joshua, and Jesus. Now look at the list of names from this database of 3,000 names. Notice there are 9 different Simons in the Gospels and Acts. That happens to be the most important, the most frequently common name found in this database of Palestinian names from this period. The second name is also Joseph, or variations thereof. John, Jonah, Jonathan, just like our Mike and Michael, etc. So that's the third most. Judas is the fourth most. The split comes when we get down to Jacob and Lazarus, number 5 and 6. There's a slight difference here. You're skipping one. So our number 6 for the New Testament is number 5 for the other database. And then it's just off a little bit. But basically that's because you're dealing with low numbers. This is an amazing parallel between what happens in our data, comparing the New Testament facts versus the actual database of names. In other words, it has what Richard Bauckham argues, and I'll show you his quote here. He says, he concludes from this that, before I change the page, look at the top Jewish Egyptian names. Eleazar, Sabattus, Joseph, Dosineth. So these are names that don't appear in our New Testament. This looks like our documents are ancient Palestinian people, not fictional characters. And this is what Cambridge scholar Richard Buckham says. These features of the New Testament data would be difficult to explain as a result of random invention of names within Palestinian Jewish Christianity, and impossible to explain as the result of such invention outside of Jewish Palestine. All the evidence indicates the general authenticity of the personal names in the Gospels. In other words, what he's saying is they look and feel and sound like real people. Some of his critics have ended up saying that basically you're picking names that sound like you would have done when you pulled out the name Horace or Margaret. You're giving it the ring of truth. When you're writing this fiction, you are basically trying to give it what they call verisimilitude, or the appearance of, you're putting it in its setting. And so he responded to this. This one guy, Jen Schroeder, said this: "This simply shows the gospel authors gave their narratives a realistic effect by choosing names that were common in the Jewish context of ancient Palestine." And so he responds to this in this brand new second edition that just came out. This book has been out for about 10 years, but there's a new second edition. It's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he says, even supposing that a gospel writer would try to make the range of his names realistic, he was only responsible for one gospel. Nobody planned the data we get from putting all four gospels together, while the contemporaries would realize that some names were common and others rare. They were unlikely to have known the relative proportions of the name usage. So he concludes, the evidence is therefore much more precise and strongly suggests the names are those of historic individuals. In other words, it's eyewitness testimony. And if it's trustworthy in this regard, then when you find a witness to be trustworthy, you trust them. All right, now, any questions about that? Next issue here. Let me scroll out. All right, so in light of this, isn't it possible that there are parallels between the resurrection of Jesus and the stories of dying and rising gods of ancient paganism? So, in other words, if you look at the ancient world, there are these sort of resurrection myths, and maybe these parallels, prove what I just described is false, because those came first. Have you ever heard this idea, by the way? Anybody heard? Some of you have heard it. So the idea that there are other resurrection stories and myths that are out there is often used as a criticism of the Christian truth claim. All right, so the parallels are often greatly overemphasized, greatly distorted. One of the best resources for this is a critic of Christianity known as Bart Ehrman. He wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And he shows that this is really a nonsensical view, because people often present this hypothesis that Jesus never really existed. It was just like these other ancient myths of the dying and rising gods. They bring that up not because there's a lot of historical fact to it, but it's kind of like an alternative religion. Their religion is they don't want Jesus to have existed, and so they kind of use this as an argument against it, even though there's no there. There's no historical truth to it. And so when you actually look at the parallels, most of them are overstated by those who attempt to argue that Jesus never existed. So gods such as Adonis, Attis, Isis, and Osiris, along with a host of other crop-related deities, were worshipped according to the cycles of nature. Followers would reenact the death and rebirth of a given deity in hopes of ensuring fertility and a good harvest. It's all about fertility and harvest and the crop cycle, which dies and is reborn in spring. So that's your resurrection story. So N.T. Wright, a theologian and apologist, writes, in Egypt, these myths included funerary practices. The aspiration of the dead was to become united with Osiris. But the new life that they might thereby experience was not a return to the life in the present world. Nobody actually expected the mummies, he says, to get up and walk about and resume normal living. That's not a thing in Egyptian religion. They don't believe that the mummy gets up and starts wandering around. That's actually the claim in the New Testament, that Jesus was in his tomb and then he's not, and he's walking around and doing stuff. In other words, in these myths, the deities die and are reborn in the netherworld, not in an actual place or point in time. Does that make sense? It's a very different thing when you compare the Christian truth claim. This is closer to just basically the pagan religion rooted in the actual death and birth of the harvest cycle. All right, question. Isn't it possible that Jesus' deeds were exaggerated over time? All right, so yes, maybe what you've said is true. These people are eyewitnesses, and they did see the people who are named in the New Testament, and these various names. They're not fictional characters, but these actual people actually saw Jesus, who was a historic person, and yet they, over time, kind of embellished what this guy did. He was a nice Jewish rabbi, and they loved him so much that over time, they stretched the stories a bit. And first he's helping people along the side of the Sea of Galilee, and then he's walking across it. That's the way miracle stories happen. They evolve over time. So question, what is the evidence that the gospel accounts that we have actually evolved over time? Do we have alternative accounts of this evolution? This is, in my view, a faith position. There are many people who have this view, and yet this particular view is itself a faith position. They believe this idea because it makes sense to them, again, but is it a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence we have? Second paragraph here. There are very compelling arguments that all the books of the New Testament were written in the crucial eyewitness period before 70 A.D. If you have a Gospel of John, open it up to chapter 5. If you look at the Gospel of John, it's supposed to be the latest of the Gospels. John chapter 5, in the first couple of verses, it says, "There is in Jerusalem a sheep gate, and by this sheep gate a pool with 5 porticos." In this paragraph, the Gospel of John, the writer of this Gospel, uses the present tense verb 3 times. This is a very strange thing to do to a city that's been demolished already and where this particular pool with 5 porticos doesn't exist anymore. If I would say to you, there is in New York City a thing called the World Trade Center building, Twin Towers. There are Twin Towers, and that'd be a weird thing for me to say now because it's been destroyed. I would say rather what? There used to be, right? There was something called the Twin Towers. John says there is. And the way he says it, and he keeps repeating this, there is, there is, there is, a number of scholars have looked at that present tense verb and they say, he's basically writing while it's still existing. Now, Josephus, the historian, talks about the Jewish war, and the city of Jerusalem was destroyed so that every building pretty much was taken down, and it looked like a plowed field, Josephus says. A plowed field. They left one wall standing to show what had been there before. You know that today as the Wailing Wall. You've probably seen pictures of it. Okay, so John chapter 5 seems to be saying that this is still there. It's written before 70 AD. That puts it in the eyewitness period. He is writing at a time when eyewitnesses are still alive. The book of Hebrews also talks about the temple practices. The priest goes to the temple, sacrifice, not that he used to. All right, so all New Testament scholars, liberal and conservative, acknowledge that Paul cites an early Christian creed in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says, "That which I received, I delivered to you." And he says specifically, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures." Notice what he says there. In accordance with the Scriptures, that which he did matches with the eyewitness testimony of the prophets who saw ahead of time. That's the according to the Scriptures part. It's something by eyewitnesses and by the witnesses of the prophets ahead of time. That he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day, that he appeared to Peter and the 12, and that he's appeared to more than 500 brothers at the same time, at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he says, if Christ isn't risen, our preaching is in vain. This one extremely liberal critic named John Dominic Crossan, he is one of the most radical of the critics, but in his book, Excavating Jesus, he writes this: the most likely source and time for Paul's reception of this tradition, because he says, that which I've received, I pass on to you. Even skeptical critics are saying that this is a creed that goes back early. This radical critic says this creed goes back very early. In fact, he says, the most likely source and time for Paul's reception of that tradition would have been Jerusalem in the early 30s. Guess what? Non-Christians are admitting there isn't this time for evolution of the story, of the fish story, the miracle stories to grow. In the early 30s, Jesus died on the cross probably 30 AD. In the early 30s, Paul receives the creed showing what the early church is believing. The early church in the early 30s is believing that Jesus rose again from the dead. This is not something later attached to Christian belief. It's part of the early proclamation. All right? This is not something, we don't have evidence that the story evolved. Whether or not it's true, that's another thing to make an argument for. But we at least know early Christians were arguing for not a nice Jesus who makes me happy, not a nice esoteric teacher, but a resurrected Christ. All right, question. Isn't it possible that Jesus never really died on the cross, but simply fell into a coma and recovered in the tomb? This is an idea that gets circled around and around and around many, many times. People think it's actually a viable hypothesis. Anybody here ever heard of Bill Nye the Science Guy? So my friend, my colleague, Michael Horton, who works with me in the White Horse and Radio Show, was at a conference where he was on a panel discussion with Bill Nye the Science Guy, and afterwards they started talking about some of the things that were coming up in the conversation, particularly between science and religion. And my friend, in this personal conversation with Bill Nye the Science Guy, was confronted with this view. Bill Nye was saying, yeah, I just think it's a bunch of hooey. I mean, he probably didn't die on the cross, and then he resuscitated in the tomb. All right? Does that thesis, does that hypothesis match the data we have? Or is it just something you want to believe? All right, so let's look at this closely. The best place to go to answer this objection is to look at an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association. They actually did a study. It's one of the most reputable medical journals on the planet. In 1986, they did this study, and here's what they concluded after looking at the evidence, the medical evidence, that's reported in the eyewitness testimony. They said, quote, clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. This is the purpose of the testimony. That they didn't know what they were reporting, but blood and water is flowing. The cardiac sac. So they're kind of looking at all these different little notices that you get by studying the four Gospels as medical, for what kind of medical information can you get. And they said, accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die appeared to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. It just doesn't support the facts when you consider the account from the eyewitnesses. All right, so how about this? What if Jesus had a twin brother or a lookalike? Now, you laugh and giggle, but this is actually a thing. There's a book on this topic, okay? So Jesus may have had a twin brother or a lookalike. It's also the view that you find in the Quran. Muslims don't actually believe that Jesus died on the cross, although they do believe he was a prophet. Quote, they say that they never crucified Jesus, they were made to think that they did. How could they be made to think that they did? Because somebody who looked like Jesus was on the cross. And I think in the Quran, it's basically the idea of like a supernatural, thing deluding people to make us think. But it basically looked like Jesus, and that's why people didn't know. Now, it's actually a lot of people don't know this. The Quran is written maybe 600 years after the time of Christ. So if you're going to go with the evidence, what are you going to go with? The first-hand account or the one written 600 years later? It's also apparent that the Quran is based, it's rooted in some of these Gnostic Gospels that are circulating in the ancient Near East. And some of those Gnostic Gospels, the fan fiction stuff that's written 200 or 300 years later, some of those had this view because there are certain views that said Jesus has to be a holy divinity person. He can't mingle with human flesh because human flesh itself is icky and wicked and distorted. And so he wasn't really a human being. He only appeared to be a human being. And he didn't really die on the cross because a God can't do that. And so it was, we only thought he appeared to look like that. Historically, that's a heresy called Docetism, but don't pay attention to that. It's just a highfalutin term. Anyway, so that ancient view is something that is circulating, and it's picked up in the Quran, and now it's their doctrine. So they don't believe that Jesus died on the cross. The question is, does it support the evidence we have from the eyewitnesses? Whether you take those eyewitness testimony as scripture or just as historical facts, this is what I recommend that you do when you're talking to somebody who doesn't hold the Bible, that first word on the front page of the front book, holy. They don't believe that part of it. Often, when a person is like that, I was one of them, I was not raised a Christian, because it's the Holy Bible, it's sort of, well, okay, you. It's something I don't share, and therefore you read it, it's, But if you present this as historical material that is so historical, we actually go beyond saying that it's historical. It's also holy, and you can get to that as a shared Christian community. But I'm just going to talk to you in terms of these being historical documents. All right, now, Thomas, who was one of the disciples, if you look at the data, was actually a twin brother he had a twin brother. That's why it's Thomas Didymus. The word in Greek means twin. Thomas, who was a twin, refused to believe what others had said about Jesus until he himself could put his hands in Jesus' side. Guess what? If you can put your hand in Jesus' side, then it was really, and you see him later as resurrected, it's a different, it's the same guy who was on the cross. It's interesting that he's the twin who wants to see that, right? Here's a twin who says, I'm not going to believe until I put my hand in his side, because he has an explanation of why somebody who looked like him could do something after he was killed, because it's the twin doing it, right? What do you do with the other members of Jesus' family who were skeptical about Jesus' claims? If you actually look at John 7 and Mark 3, various members of his family are not believers. In fact, in Mark, it says they thought he was out of his mind. This is, by the way, something I wouldn't recommend putting in your fiction if you're going to write something, a fiction, about your brother or your sister, that they're actually divine. I wouldn't put in the fiction that you, for a while, thought he was crazy. I just wouldn't recommend that you do that, because it's weird. But in this case, it lends a lot of credibility to the story after the fact. It says here that his family members became believers after the resurrection. You look at Acts, they're there at the upper room, etc. While it's going on, they think he's crazy. If they knew he had a twin brother, I think the cat's out of the bag. I don't think they would have become believers after the resurrection. All right, so now what about the possibility of mass hallucination, right? You got some mushrooms, you got some heat in the sun, and all these people are having this amazing experience. Is that the best way to explain the data? That actually is something that people who want to believe that this isn't true, they kind of hang on to. So is it a view that's consistent with the facts of the case? What are we to do with the doubting members of Jesus' own family? All right, so if they're all together in this place where they're having, let's just say, the potluck. We had some interesting mushrooms in the potluck, and now they're all seeing Jesus. The people who weren't part of that interesting experience are, you have people like the Apostle Paul and the doubting members of Jesus' family. What do we do with them? And if it is this this sort of weird experience where you're hallucinating all at the same time with the same vision. That itself kind of requires a miracle of its own. So you have the 500 witnesses. The solution isn't plausible on its own. It doesn't fit the evidence of the case. Finally, the gospel accounts focus their attention on the empty tomb. Under this theory, the tomb would not be empty. They had a hallucination about seeing Jesus, the guy they loved, and now they miss him, and now they're all hallucinating about him. But when you go check the tomb, there he is. He's still in the tomb. So it doesn't really match. John reports that which was from the beginning, which we have heard with our ears, which we have seen, not in a vision, but with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. Okay, notice the eyewitness nature of that testimony. He is getting very specific. He's got 3 body parts here. That which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've held and our hands have touched. This is what we proclaim to you concerning the word of life. All right, for further reading, I recommend just having on your shelf, if you are interested in following up on this, 2 books that would help you to see the non-Christian side of things and then the Christian side. So on the Christian side, a book by Michael Licona. Now, this is a thick book, but if you ever have any question about any of these kinds of topics, he has done a lot of research, and you can kind of just go to that one chapter that deals with that one question that you're concerned about. All right? And the other book is by a non-Christian, by a guy named Geza Vermes. The good thing about this book on the resurrection, he's a very good scholar, Oxford or Cambridge, one of the two, but he goes through a lot of the things I just went through and has similar conclusions to every single one, except for the part where he gets to one possible view of what happened during the resurrection, which is not the Christian take. He ends up saying something like, he rose again in the hearts of the people instead of in actual history. But most of the accounts, he is agreeing with me that these are not good hypotheses. The position he does arrive at is pretty weak, and it's easy to see. Question way in the back. Geza Vermes. G-E-Z-A, Vermes, V-E-R-M-E-S. Some people pronounce it Vermesh. I don't really know which way to go. But Michael Licona and Geza Vermes. The Resurrection of Jesus and then The Resurrection. 2 books to read and interact with if you want to follow up on these questions. Yes?
Do you have any podcasts you suggest?
Yes, lots of them. So the podcast that I am involved with is called The White Horse Inn. And the program that we actually had 3 programs with Michael Licona where he walks through a lot of this information. You know, just in terms of evaluating the New Testament documents as history documents, do they work as history documents? Another one is Stand to Reason with a guy named Greg Koukl, K-O-U-K-L, Stand to Reason, S-T-R. Greg Koukl is a fantastic, easy-to-understand apologist, and he's always having these kinds of shows talking about this kind of material, apologetics, but also stuff like faith that you're hearing from across the spectrum, intelligent design or history for the resurrection. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Time to stump the apologist. I've answered all their questions. This is awesome. No more questions? All right, well then I'm done. Thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoy your time at Faith Ascent.